Responsible Statecraft has a piece entitled Biden's American Bedtime Story Falls Flat. Repeating nostrums from the height of the unpopular moment, the president insists the U.S. must support two ongoing wars because its leadership, quote, holds the world together, end quote. What are we to make of all of this now? Well, for insight, let's turn to our first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, Dr. Horne, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Daniel Larison writes, the President's Oval Office address on U.S. support for Ukraine and Israel was long on ideological declarations and short on real justifications for his administration's policies, repeating nostrums from the height of the unipolar moment. Biden insisted that the U.S. must support both ongoing wars because it is, quote, it is the indispensable nation, end quote, and that, quote, American leadership is what holds the world together, end quote. The president also asserted that Ukraine and Israel's success was vital for America's national security, but his defense of this claim amounted to little more than a revised domino theory that failure in one place would lead to disasters elsewhere. Dr. Horne, the entire time that I was listening to Joe Biden, all I heard was the late Fred Hampton saying, all we get are answers that don't answer, explanations that don't explain, and conclusions that don't conclude. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, I think that that's an accurate and pithy summary, but it's also saddening and dangerous at the same time. Saddening in the sense that Mr. Biden still has difficulty reading from a teleprompter, which made this a rather sorry spectacle in terms of presentation. And then when you get to the substance, I wish that Mr. Biden would consult the borrowing costs that are now being imposed on the United States government. The era of 0% interest rates have disappeared, perhaps forever, as far as Washington is concerned. And that means that both the debt and the deficit will continue to go through the roof. At the same time, Washington is picking up the tab for 150,000 Ukrainian civil servants. And now, with the Israeli economy about to seize up as a result of the weekend warriors to the tune of 300,000 plus folks who were stocking grocery shelves and sitting in office cubicles as recently as 2 weeks ago, now in green fatigues on the front line, there's a distinct possibility that the United States will have to bail out the Israeli economy, not to mention these multi-billion-dollar arms packages that Senator Mitch McConnell said, not inaccurately, would basically redound to the benefit of the U.S. military-industrial complex. That's something to consider. But it's also the fact that during his lightning 7-hour trip to Israel to give a bear hug to Bibi Netanyahu, inadvertently, Mr. Biden revealed that there are already U.S. boots on the ground in Israel, U.S. Special Forces. In addition to this naval flotilla in the Eastern Mediterranean off the coast of Israel, we have been told by the U.S. press that Mr. Biden has been sending messages through his State Department to Hezbollah and indirectly to Iran that if they decide to intervene in Israel or in Gaza to support Hamas, that this will be taken as a signal for the U.S. military to get involved. At the same time, we know that in the last few days, there have been attacks on the unauthorized, unwarranted U.S. military forces on the ground in Syria, uninvited by the government. We know that the Syrians did invite the Russians to their territory. It would not be beyond the realm of possibility for the United States to seek to go for the gusto and somehow arrange an attack upon Russian forces in order to drain Moscow so that they presumably will be less effective in Ukraine. But obviously that could be a trigger for a wider conflict. Speaking of a wider conflict, we also know, it's just been revealed, that when that U.S. vessel supposedly a few days ago interrupted a missile shot from Yemen, supposedly destined for Israel, that actually it was part and parcel of a lengthy 9-hour battle between what have been described as Iranian proxy forces, speaking of the Houthis in Yemen, and their U.S. counterparts. These U.S. vessels in the neighborhood are sitting ducks, some of them as long as 2 or 3 football fields. I dare say that even with my age and not being in ideal condition, I could probably wound one of those ships, not to mention the Houthis or Hezbollah other forces. I should also mention that the Turks, who are part of NATO, the U.S.-dominated military alliance, are totally unhappy about what's going on. Recall a few years ago that the Turks sought to send an Angel of Mercy, a ship loaded with humanitarian supplies, during a previous besieging of Gaza by the Israelis. And for their troubles, the ship was boarded by Israeli authorities. A number of Turks were roughhoused and manhandled. Some did not leave with their lives intact. Turkey has, or Turkey, I should say, has a reputation for developing fierce fighters. They can mobilize 2 million fighters within an hour, within a month, it is said. Do not rule out the possibility that as a result of these tensions, that Turkey may be invited to depart from NATO, a wounding blow to that military alliance. And if that takes place, keep in mind not only these tensions around Israel, but pre-existing tensions involving France and Turkey. I should also mention that the U.S. forces in Iraq could come under attack. In fact, we should not rule out the possibility, and I underscore the phrase possibility, that in the next few days or weeks, perhaps months, there will be a full court press on both the Israelis and their U.S. allies that could involve not only attacks from the north by north of Israel by southern Lebanon from Hezbollah, from the south by Hamas, also attacks on U.S. unwarranted, unauthorized forces in Syria, ditto for U.S. forces in Syria. In other words, we may be reaching a significant fork in the road, and that possibility is also supplemented by the statement put out by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is spearheaded by Indonesia, which has the largest predominantly Muslim population on planet Earth, in the country of 250 million. They excoriated the Israelis. Keep in mind that the Pakistanis, who are no friends of Israel, have offered to provide nuclear weapons to any force that is attacked by Israeli nuclear weapons. And by the way, keep in mind that the Israeli nuclear facility has been monitored and surveilled without apparent Israeli knowledge in the past 10 years by Hezbollah forces. So once again, we are reaching a fork in the road. We're reaching a crossroads. I think that these attacks right now upon U.S. dissidents and U.S. dissenters from this headlong rush to World War III, that will continue for some time to come, their persecution, their harassment, I'm afraid to say. But in the long term, as it becomes clear that Israel and its right-wing policies have helped to lead the United States to the brink of yet another quagmire, complementing Afghanistan and Iraq and other sites too numerous to mention, there's going to be a round-robin session of finger-pointing within the U.S. ruling class. There will be bitter recriminations. It may lead to a weakening of the Zionist lobby in the United States of America as a direct result. And that, in a sense, will be yet another withering blow to the arrogant pretensions of not only U.S. imperialism, but their allies in Israel. And let me make one more point, which is settler colonialism, this iniquitous system that besets Israel and the United States. We need to recognize that settler colonialism involves a kind of class collaboration amongst the settlers, be they Jewish in Israel, where Jewish workers and Jewish capitalists are supposed to be on the same team, and the workers are supposed to somehow ignore their deteriorating life chances. And of course, in the United States too, European settlers, so-called white settlers. That helps to explain the Trump phenomenon, this idea of class collaboration. Given that this right-wing policy of class collaboration, which has propelled both Israel and the United States, is reaching a fork in the road, perhaps reaching the point of no return, let us hope, let us struggle to ensure that this right-wing policy is ditched. But if you accept the arguments presented by the leading Israeli intellectual David Grossman in the Financial Times of London just a few days ago, once Netanyahu is thrown overboard, which is just a matter of time, he says, do not expect a kinder and gentler Israeli regime, that the Israeli population, says Grossman, are on fire, they're aflame, they're thirsting for bloody revenge, which is now helping to propel Israel into the mother of all catastrophes if they launch this ill-fated, ill-considered ground invasion of Gaza.
Dr. Horne, one of the things I think is important and critical from the speech to evaluate is where President Biden referred to the U.S. as the indispensable nation that holds the world together. And the article says it's an astonishingly arrogant belief that the security of the rest of the world hinges on constant U.S. interference. Dr. Horne.
Well, it reminds me of that saying that the 1990s are calling to Mr. Biden, and they say that they want their foreign policy nostrums back. That is to say that that speech by Mr. Biden presented some of the greatest hits from the 1990s, including quoting directly, explicitly, the late U.S. Secretary of State under Clinton, speaking of Madeleine Albright. Someone should alert Mr. Biden to today's reality, which is that we're in a multipolar world, that by some measures, the Chinese economy is already larger than the U.S. economy, which obviously causes us to reflect on the fact that despite this idea that China is the big enchilada, is the ballgame, the United States remains bogged down in Ukraine, now about to be bogged down in Israel. And so Mr. Biden is obviously out of touch with reality. It would be perhaps one-sided, even ageist, to ascribe that to his being 80 years old plus, because this is a class-based policy. It's not just the policy of an individual, but I'm afraid to tell Mr. Biden, it's just like when a baseball team finishes behind when they're supposed to win, you can't fire the team, you fire the manager. And so like Bibi Netanyahu is going to be walking the plank sooner rather than later. He's a dead man walking politically. Sooner rather than later, that same unfortunate label will be affixed to the breastplate of one Joseph R. Biden.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks,